Greetings Hex and Counter players, and welcome to episode 2 of my presentation on Wargame Design Studios, Panzer Campaigns, Donbas 43, and in particular the essay that comes with this pack called The Operational Art of 1943, Why Depth Beats Frontage. And in episode 1 we discussed sections 1 to 6. So today we will kick off with section 7, German Mobile Reserves in 1943, from counterstroke weapon to fire brigade. German operational culture prized counterstroke. In 1941-42, that culture often had the material to match mobile formations, experienced crews, and the ability to concentrate and strike. By 1943, the culture remained, but the material was increasingly scarce and the operational environment increasingly hostile to easy concentration. A mobile reserve is the most decisive when it is genuinely a reserve, rested enough to move, maintained enough to fight, concentrated enough to deliver weight, and committed quickly enough that the breach has not already widened. In 1943, German mobile formations were increasingly used less as instruments of choice and more as instruments of necessity. They were moved repeatedly along interior lines to plug gaps and extinguish crises. Each movement consumed fuel and punished the vehicle park. Each emergency commitment reduced time for maintenance and training. Each battle reduced experienced crews. And each redeployment tended to arrive to find the attacker already established anti-tank density and artillery belts. This has two practical consequences that matter in Donbas. First, the timing window narrows. After a breach, the defender has a short period in which a counterstroke can still restore continuity. If the counterattack arrives late, it can still be tactically sharp, but may no longer be operationally decisive. Second, reserves are fragmented. Instead of arriving as a massed, coherent force with a clear mission, they arrive as mixtures scraped together. A regiment here, an assault gun battalion there, a handful of tanks attached to an infantry division, a Kampf group assembled on the fly. Such formations can fight well, but their operational weight is limited. They buy time more often than they reset the front. This is why it is misleading to describe German frontage failure as a simple doctrinal mistake. The German defence still understood what it wanted to do. The difficulty was that it increasingly lacked the depth in reserves and the freedom of manoeuvre needed to do it on a decisive scale. In the Donbas, this becomes the story. The German method can still deliver sharp local counterattacks, but it struggles to deliver the decisive counterstroke that turns the rupture back into line. Section 8. Soviet echelons in 1943. Depth as a practical system. If the German story is the erosion of reserve depth, the Soviet story in 1943 is the rebuilding of depth as a system. This is not just more troops. It is the construction of an operational machine. Staffs that can plan and shift fires. Engineers that can open corridors fast enough to matter. Artillery that can be massed and then moved forward in step with the advance. And a force structure designed to keep the offensive alive after the first trench line is taken. In Soviet practice, depth operated at multiple levels at once. At the strategic level, the Red Army increasingly applied pressure across broad sectors, preventing the Germans from concentrating their reserves comfortably. Even a skilled defender cannot respond decisively everywhere if each response creates vulnerability elsewhere. This stretches the enemy's decision cycle and makes his reserve allocation a losing game. At the front and army levels, depth appears as echeloning. Assault formations break the tactical zone. Follow-on rifle formations widen the shoulders, reduce the number of bypass strongpoints, and secure the corridor. Mobile corps exploit through the breach, but exploitation only becomes decisive if it is supported by continued movement on the shoulders and by follow-on forces that prevent a pinch at the base. Engineers are not decorative. They transform a breach into a corridor wide enough for continuous traffic. Artillery is not merely preparatory fire. It is the tool that suppresses strong points, defeats counterattacks, and shapes the defender's ability to move and concentrate. This is also where Soviet learning shows itself in mundane but decisive details. A deep thrust is not only an arrow on a map, it is a column of vehicles, guns, fuel trucks, bridging trains, ammunition dumps, headquarters signals, and marching infantry. If lanes through minefields are too few, corridors become traffic jams. If crossings are insufficient, the flow of mechanised forces becomes intermittent rather than continuous. If the infantry cannot keep up on the shoulders, the corridor narrows and becomes vulnerable. Soviet depth in 1943 increasingly meant planning for these friction points rather than discovering them in the middle of the operation. A final nuance matters. 1943 is a hinge year. Soviet deep methods are improving and becoming increasingly effective, but they remain uneven. The change is that the Red Army is now capable of maintaining depth in enough places for long enough that German responses are increasingly reactive and exhausting. Section 9. The Myas Breakthrough. Breach, exploit, survive the pinch. The Myas line had a reputation for strength, but in August the Soviets struck with concentrated weight. Heavy artillery preparation aimed to suppress German batteries, neutralise forward strongpoints, and create shock at the moment the infantry advanced. Engineer effort mattered immediately. Mines had to be cleared, lanes marked, and crossings made trafficable. Air support, when effective, contributed to disruption, hitting movement routes, assembly areas and command nodes to slow reaction. The penetration succeeded in a sector where German forces were thin and local reserves were limited. The critical step then followed. Soviet mobile forces were introduced rapidly. This is deep offensive practice at its most visible, transforming a local breach into an operational rupture before the defender can reorganise. Mobile formations pushed beyond the initial belt, seeking nodes that would unhinge the defence. The attacker is not merely taking trenches, it is threatening the defender's ability to coordinate, supply and move. Then came the German response: counterattack the base. German doctrine wanted the corridor narrowed and cut, ideally trapping the spearhead. Even with scarcity, German commanders assembled combined arms groupings, sometimes improvised, to strike the flanks. For a time, these counterattacks could be dangerous. Corridors tighten quickly if the shoulders do not move. If mobile spearheads outrun the infantry protecting the corridor, they risk isolation. This is precisely where Soviet depth became a survival mechanism. Soviet commanders increasingly treated corridor security as an operational task rather than an afterthought. Follow-on rifle forces were fed into the shoulders. Anti-tank defences were moved forward in dense belts. Artillery shifted from breach support to counterattack, defeating concentrations and punishing movement along predictable routes. Even when the corridor tightened, the Soviets had layers of response, more than a single advance or retreat choice. German heavy armour could still arrive and strike hard. In 1943, German armoured counterattacks remained dangerous in the tactical sense, but timing is everything. After a breach, the window for action is short. A late counterstroke can be tactically sharp, yet operationally insufficient if the corridor has already widened and the attacker has already built anti-tank density. This is one of the most important operational lessons of the year. The defender's traditional answer still exists, but the conditions under which it produces operational decisions are narrowing. When the German counterstroke fails to restore the line, the defence crosses into a new phase. The front stops being repairable in the old way. Section 10. From rupture to pursuit, when movement becomes the battlefield. Once a rupture cannot be closed, a frontage system becomes a retreat under pressure. In that phase, reserves are increasingly used to cover withdrawals and prevent encirclement rather than to restore continuity. Covering actions can be vital. They can save armies, but they rarely reset the operational tempo. Donbas geography amplifies this. Once a fortified belt is compromised and cannot be resealed, the attacker's targets become the levers of movement. Junctions, towns, rail lines and road crossings. Take a junction and lateral movement falters. Threaten a road and retreat columns jam. Disrupt rail movement and the defender's ability to shift artillery and supplies collapses. The attacker does not need to annihilate every unit in place. It needs to make the defender's next line impossible to build in time. Political constraints compound the problem. If leadership demands holding valuable ground, withdrawal decisions are delayed. But delay in a deep operational environment is costly. Withdrawal routes become threatened, and then a controlled retreat becomes a scramble. In such conditions, equipment is abandoned, units fragment, and cohesion erodes. The defender is not merely giving ground, it is losing the ability to convert ground into time. Soviet exploitation in 1943 was not only tanks. Mechanised formations were the obvious spearheads, but cavalry formations also played a real operational role in pursuit and interdiction. In terrain where roads were damaged, fuel shortages were a concern, and trafficability was uncertain, cavalry offered mobile, less dependent on fuel, and sometimes more resilient over compromised routes. Their value was practical, probing gaps, cutting roads, harassing retreating columns and forcing defenders to spend scarce forces keeping routes open. They were part of Soviet depth, the connective tissue that turns rupture into sustained pressure. German counterattacks continued in this phase, but their purpose increasingly shifted. They became less about restoring the old line and more about buying time for the next line, covering withdrawals and preventing Soviet mobile forces from turning retreat into encirclement. The reserve becomes a shield more often than a sword. Section 11. Donbas in the 1943 arc from Kursk to the Dnieper. Donbas fits into 1943 as part of a sequence. Early 1943 included German operational recovery and counterattacks that regained ground, demonstrating that the Germans could still punish Soviet overreach when conditions favoured them. Kursk demonstrated the power of Soviet defensive depth and the limits of German offensive capacity. After Kursk, Soviet operations increasingly aimed not only to punish the Germans back, but to keep them moving, keep them reacting, and deny them time to rebuild a stable defence. In the Donbas, this meant exploiting the fact that German reserves were demanded across multiple crises. It meant sustaining pressure so that local German counterattacks, though sometimes tactically successful, could not reset the operational tempo. It meant widening corridors so that German attempts to pinch penetrations were less likely to succeed. It meant turning the fight from taking positions into forcing displacement. Once the German system was compelled into retreat under pressure, successive lines were often less prepared and more vulnerable to the next blow. This is the deeper answer to the title's claim. Depth beats frontage in 1943, not because the Germans were incapable and the Soviets suddenly became flawless, but because depth is a system designed to withstand repeated shocks and high attrition. Frontage can function under those conditions only if it is supported by sufficient reserves and sufficient freedom of manoeuvre. When these supports vanish, frontage becomes brittle. It can look solid until it is punctured, then it tears. Donbas shows how punctures become tears. A concentrated Soviet blow ruptures a sector. Exploitation forces push into operational space. German counterattacks attempt to pinch the base but lack mass or timeliness. Soviet follow-on echelons keep the corridor open. The rupture widens. The defender cannot restore continuity. A retreat begins. Under pressure, retreats become expensive and sometimes chaotic. The next line is weaker. The cycle repeats. That is the operational art of 1943 in miniature. 12. 7 lessons from Donbas. Why depth beats frontage. Lesson 1. Frontage defence is conditional, not inherently foolish. A continuous line can hold and even win when it is dense enough to slow an attacker everywhere, when the defender has the freedom to trade space for time, and when operational reserves can counterattack quickly and decisively at the moment the attacker is most exposed. Donbas shows how fragile that formula becomes when any of those conditions erode. In July 1943, the Germans could still make a frontage system work by importing mobile mass and delivering a counterstroke. In August, with reserves thinner and timing worse, the same logic stopped producing stability and started producing only delay. Lesson 2. Fortifications without reserve depth are ultimately brittle. The Myers position could be formidable tactically. Trenches, strong points, mines, pre-registered fires, but a defensive belt wins operationally only if it buys time for a response that restores coherence. Once a rupture forms, earthworks alone cannot reseal it. In Donbas, the decisive question is less how strong is the line than can the defender close a breach quickly enough with enough weight before it widens into an operational corridor. When that answer is no, fortifications become an expensive time-buying device rather than a stability-producing system. Lesson 3. Deep offence is defined by follow-through, not by breakthrough. The breach is only the opening act. The operational result comes from widening the rupture, sustaining momentum, and preventing the defender from resealing the gap. That requires echelons, corridor security, and reserves ready to meet counter-attacks. The winter Donbas experience shows what happens when deep thrusts outrun sustainment and shoulder protection. The later Donbas fighting shows the payoff when corridor thinking is treated as a first-order operational problem. Lesson 4. Temporal depth wins campaigns. The Red Army of 1943 increasingly fought as a generator of consecutive operations and phases, denying the defender meaningful recovery time. Even when an initial effort was contained, it could still shape the next blow by consuming reserves and forcing redeployments. Donbas shows how earlier fighting can set conditions for later success, especially when the defender must repeatedly spend mobile reserves to extinguish crises. Lesson 5. Operational reserves are decision power. Reserves are not uncommitted strength. They are the capacity to react to reality rather than to plan. Donbas demonstrates this from both angles. German reserves could still be decisive when they arrived early and in enough mass to deliver a true counterstroke. When they arrived late, in fragments, or were already committed elsewhere, they shifted from instruments of restoration to instruments of delay. Soviet reserves, especially follow-on echelons and mobile exploitation forces, serve both to push success into operational depth and to absorb counterattack attempts without losing the initiative. Lesson 6. Politics can override operational logic, usually with a price. The Donbas was not merely terrain, it was economically and symbolically valuable, shaping German decision-making. Holding a little longer is understandable, but in a deep operational environment, it often means waiting until withdrawal routes are threatened. Late withdrawals become hurried withdrawals, and hurried withdrawals shed equipment, cohesion, and sometimes entire formations. Deep operations exploit not only physical weakness, but decision constraints, turning political delay into operational opportunity. Lesson 7. Terrain changes the problem mid-campaign, and depth-based systems are built to exploit that shift. In the assault phase, rivers and prepared positions favour the defender. In the exploitation and pursuit phase, open country, roads and rail lines favour the attacker, who can move fast and disrupt the rear. A frontage system is designed to hold a line and restore it after local damage. A depth-based system aims to transform a local breach into operational motion, into a pursuit that denies the defender the stable pauses a frontage defence needs to rebuild. In 1943, the Eastern Front increasingly rewarded the side that could keep options in reserve, keep pressure in time, and keep its combat power layered enough to survive the enemy's best reply. The Donbas is where that shift becomes concrete. A fortified line can still delay, but once a rupture, can't be resealed. The campaign turns into a contest of movement, cohesion and operational stamina. That is why Donbas 43 isn't just a story of towns and rivers. It's a study in how depth, properly built and properly used, turns local success into irreversible momentum. So there you go, viewers. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation of the operational art of 1943, why depth beats frontage. If you'd like to discuss anything to do with this presentation or the operational art of war, please do so on the War Game Design Studio Panzer Campaigns forum. Thank you.